Welcome to Dharma Talk number 4. And tonight's talk will be about both the fourth establishment of mindfulness and the fourth tetrad of the 16 steps of mindfulness of breathing. So I'll firstly talk about the fourth establishment of mindfulness, which is also called contemplating dhammas. That's one way it's named. And here we have, I think I mentioned probably early in the retreat, there's a difference between Dharma when it's spelt with a capital D, that's only in English anyway, and Dhammas when they're spelt with a little d. A capital D Dhamma, you've probably heard the word Dhamma a lot. It's usually relates to nature, the truth of nature, the way things are, the Buddha's teachings, and people have dhammas, they have their truths, and sometimes the dhamma is called the Buddha's Dhamma, the Buddha Dhamma, and you can also have Christian Dhamma and all those sorts of ways of using Dhamma. And then with a little d, it means phenomena, or it means the experience of something. The experience of a thing, not a thing, but the experience of a thing. It's a unit of experience. We experience dhammas. So the focus of the fourth application of mindfulness, contemplating dhammas, see if I can get this over there. Contemplating dhammas involves bringing attention or awareness to a range of phenomena. Life, in fact. But in the sutta, I think there's five subdomains. And I won't go through the subdomains right now, I'll mention them in a minute. But the application of mindfulness focuses on something called dependent arising, and also and psychological patterns that include relevant experiences in life. Like it can include all the experiences of life that haven't been included in body, feelings, and mind. You know, there's applications of body, feelings, and mind. And there's a little bit of a difference here as well. With the fourth application, with the first, second, and third application of mindfulness, or establishment of mindfulness, it's also called foundation of mindfulness, there's a kind of passive observation. With the fourth application, there's more of an intelligent engagement. An intelligent engagement of looking at patterns of things and how they work. Essentially, it's about looking at ways we can reduce the unhelpful or the unwholesome or the unskillful and prevent it, and also increase the wholesome, the skillful, and the helpful. So coming back to what we're looking at with this contemplating dhammas, which is also called, I've called it mindfulness of phenomena as well, I think in my writings that you would have had. There's this experience called dependent arising, and some of you may have heard me talk about dependent arising or read about it independently. Basically, it's the principle with which the Buddha explained how things arise and also how they cease, how they stop, how they come to be and how they disappear. And it's quite profound and complicated and sophisticated, yet it's often explained in the suttas like this: when this is, that is. With the arising of this, that also arises. When this is not, that is not. With the ceasing of this, that ceases. So I'll just explain this a little bit more. The Four Noble Truths, as we learned about Lisa gave her lovely Dharma talk on the first night, we learned about the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths are an example of dependent arising. When there's a cause for suffering, when there's a cause for dukkha, dukkha will arise. When there's no cause for suffering, in other words, when there's no craving, as an example, then suffering doesn't arise. So that's when there's the second truth, the second noble truth, the origins of suffering, the first noble truth will arise. But when there's no craving, when one is practicing the Noble Eightfold Path to its completion and completely, then there is freedom. And sometimes I think about something, put it into simple clinical language. I used to do a lot of workshops with clinicians, and when I talk about dependent arising, I'd often talk about a saying that you find in ACT. ACT is something called, ACT is an approach to therapy. It's called acceptance and commitment therapy. And it goes something like this. When you do what you've always done, you're going to get what you always got. So if you're caught up in craving, you're caught up in grasping, becoming, you're caught up in greed, ignorance and hatred, then you're going to get the results of that. You're going to if you behave in those ways, you're going to get the results of that. If you do something different, you'll get the results of something different. So insight meditation, and you remember that I said, I think it was on night 2, I spoke about the differences between insight meditation and serenity meditation. And insight meditation is about perceiving or understanding, I should say that, not perceiving, but understanding and realizing dependent arising, as well as realizing three universal characteristics of existence. They're also called the marks of existence. So what we're doing, we're understanding condition arising, we're understanding conditionality. What leads to what? When this is, that is. So, we can see that when we're caught up in a mess of something in our minds, when we're entangled with a hindrance, for example, then something else arises. We usually have suffering. But if we can engage in one of the 7 factors of awakening, or all of them, we'll see something else happen. We'll have a bit of freedom from that. So it's about insight meditation is related to seeing how things condition one another. By the way, another way of describing dependent arising could be as interdependence. Like no things arise in and of themselves. They're dependent on other things for their arising. And yet another way we could understand dependent arising is what I think I've mentioned once here on this retreat, that there's no such thing as a thing. There's no noun in all this. There are just streams of dependently arising processes interacting. This is the way life is. I think in my book, I've talked about dependent arising like a forest, like a forest, and where everything's kind of moving together. Everything's kind of depending on one another, and if a noxious weed takes over, it wrecks the system. But what we think about is how everything is kind of moving and dependent on each other. Processes are kind of moving along. They're in their own little processes, but they are kind of intertwining and becoming interdependent. That's another way of understanding dependent arising. And I remember one time I listened to Stephen Batchelor talk about dependent arising, and he called it life. And I took that on board, and I thought, well, you can sit at a railway station or an airport and just watch. And you can go out and sit on the street and just watch, or you can go into the forest and just sit and listen and watch. And I'm not. what's that term called? Dadiri. Is that right? Dadiri. Yeah, I think that's something. Look, I don't not sure what that means. I haven't practiced any of that, but I got the feeling that it means sitting, watching, and being with nature. So you're almost contemplating life. Well, you are contemplating life, contemplating nature, and you could say that that's the practice of this. That's a practice of this foundation as well, because you're contemplating dhammas. Okay. So as I mentioned before, there are 5 subdomains in this particular, in the sutra on this particular foundation. And I won't go through them all, but I'll mention 2 that are relevant for this retreat. And one is being mindful of the hindrances. That's a whole domain, subdomain of mindfulness. Being aware of the hindrances, how they arise, and how you can reduce their impact. That's where we talk about intelligent engagement with these experiences, rather than just passive observation. You could just say, "Oh, there's a hindrance," and actually that works. When you become aware of a hindrance, it's kind of like, 50% of the way to working with it. Just to notice it is almost enough to ameliorate it, is to reduce it. Where am I going here? Oh yes, the other contemplation that's relevant, the other subdomain that's relevant here is it's about looking at the 7 factors of awakening. It's being aware of the 7 factors of awakening, knowing how they arise and how you can maintain them, if that makes sense. So we've got these 2 polar opposites. We've got the hindrances, which are about what blocks our path and how we can intelligently reduce the hindrances. So there's some discernment involved here. It's not just passive observation. When I say passive observation, I don't mean it like that. I mean it that when we're mindful of any object, we're tracking that object, we're seeing how it changes, and we're tracking what it is and how it changes. So we're not completely passive, I should say. So with the 7 factors of awakening, of course, they can be cultivated individually, or they can be cultivated in one as a kind of a process and a sequence. And it doesn't necessarily go in that sequence of mindfulness leading to investigation of dhammas, leading to energy, leading to joy, leading to tranquility, leading to concentration or samadhi, leading to equanimity. Usually it's presented like that, and but it can be in other kind of sequences. Like I've practiced it with having an experience and then bringing mindfulness to it. Like I might have an experience of loving kindness, for example. And loving kindness in itself is enough to awaken you to a particular stage of awakening, but not enough to fulfill awakening. But if you apply the 7 factors of awakening to it, it's enough for full awakening. So this is how you could do it. You'll have loving kindness arise. Then you bring awareness to it, or you bring this mindfulness to it. Oh yeah, there's loving kindness. And then you bring some investigation to it. Oh, yes, there's no aversion here. There's no ill will. The hindrance of ill will is gone. Isn't that interesting? And then you get energy about it. Oh, wow, this is so cool. You get motivated, you get perseverance, you want to stick at it. The energy comes almost in and of itself. There's less of an ego, trying to do it all. It's just this process of things, because you've inquired into it. There's a natural evolution of energy being there, and it seems to be running all by itself. And wow, that's joyous. That's something that brings about this wonderful factor of awakening called joy. which is, and I think I've mentioned this, or Lisa's mentioned this a couple of times, it is a reinforcer for the practice. I don't think, if we don't have joy, the practice becomes pretty dull and tedious and like a punishment. But when we have joy, it reinforces itself. It's the juice. It gives fuel to the practice. So we have joy. And our minds become tranquil. Tranquil. And that naturally leads on to a samadhi, the gathering in of attention, the unification of the mind, and a kind of settling and stabilizing. And from that arises equanimity. So that's the usual way it's described. It's like branches of a tree. You start with mindfulness and it goes out and goes on and like this. However, it can also be cultivated by itself, as I mentioned a moment ago. And there is in one of the suttas, Sariputta describes the 7 factors of awakening like, imagine a wealthy person has a big cupboard and he chooses the clothing he's going to wear for the day. That's what I do with the 7 factors of awakening. I go and choose something that's what I feel like doing today, and I put it on. So you might practice mindfulness completely, or investigation, or joy, or tranquility, or energy, and so on and so forth. So something about this is that if you're unsure if you're practicing, just look into your heart and see if you're practicing one of the 7 factors of awakening, and you'll be practicing. Even if you're in Woolies, or doing cleaning, or making lunches for the kids. Whatever you're doing, you can bring these 7 factors of awakening to this, and you can wake up. So coming back to the 5 hindrances, they're really useful. It's really useful to practice mindfulness of them because they cut to the chase. And I was just thinking of a couple of examples of this afternoon when I was reviewing the talk. And I remember I went on a retreat. It was just a self-retreat. It was probably about 15 years ago, up at Bodhi Tree. Bodhi Tree is a little monastery outside of Lismore. Very quiet. And I chose the long weekend to go on this retreat to begin my 2-week retreat or something like that. And I was settling in, and I was really quiet. And I heard this. And I thought, I was just hearing. I'm just hearing. And then it just kept going. And eventually I kind of got up and said, what is that? And I looked around, I walked down to the gate, and across the road I could see there was some young people set up a camp. And what do they call those motorbikes that you race around? Sorry? Quad? No, it wasn't quad. It was motorcycles. Trail bikes, that's it. Trail bikes. They'd set up a track about 50 metres away from me. And I thought, So I went back to my, where I was meditating, and I was just going hearing. And I was getting really agitated. And then I struck on it. I said, it's aversion. Aversion. That's the hindrance. And as soon as I could note it and pinpoint it, it was fine. I just let it go. There wasn't any more aversion, and I could get on with my practice. And they eventually were left after 3 days. But those 3 days weren't a waste of time. I wasn't caught up in this kind of struggle and battle. And here I'm coming into a monastery, and it's supposed to be quiet. Don't those people know that I'm in a monastery? Shouldn't the council tell them that there's a monastery across the road? It's not fair. So anyway, I think it's very helpful to recognize if you've got any suffering, if there's suffering somewhere happening with you, step back a bit, look at what's happening in the mind, as Lisa was just describing in her lovely Dharma talk last night. Where's the mind at? What hindrance is present? and it can be a kind of a helpful way to reduce the impact of those hindrances. Yep. Yeah. Go crazy. Yeah. Yeah, there's a mention for the recording. There's a mention from someone in the audience about cicadas being in Australia, and Europeans come here and they go crazy because it can be mind, can be really crazy. But beg pardon? Yeah, some years they are. But for many of us, they're associated with Christmas, and that's like a time off and chilling out, and so it's a kind of a pleasant thing. You don't have them in South Australia? Thanks, everyone. That's great. So sometimes we're kind of in these knots of suffering, and the point I'm making is if we're entangled in some sort of aversion or some sort of craving for sensual pleasures or some sort of sloth and torpor is actually a different story, but restlessness and worry or paralyzing doubt. If you can just, actually sloth and torpor here is like this as well. If you can just be mindful of it, it really, really helps to notice it. You can even note it if you want, if that's helpful for you. There are particular strategies for each of these hindrances, like specific strategies. And also there's specific factors of jhanas, which I won't go into right now, that are factors of jhanas are aspects of how we get very concentrated in our mind, concentrated minds. There are various factors that deal with the various hindrances. But I think the most basic principle here, and in this area of mindfulness, it's about being aware of it and naming it and knowing it and seeing it for what it is, rather than letting the thief steal our mind and steal our happiness. We catch the thief and we say, I see you. Actually, it's like Mara. Yeah, anybody know about Mara? Some of you may know Mara. Mara is the tempter. Mara is Mara's like the devil in Buddhism, but it's not really like the devil. It's just this. It's what. It's the opposite to the Buddha. And Mara used to come along and tempt the Buddha as well. But the Buddha used to say, "I see you, Mara. You can't trick me." And that's what I tell people who come to see me and they're caught up with these negative, high self-criticism. Like, people come to me. I see a lot of people that are putting themselves down. And I suggest to them, say, I see you, Mara. I see you. You're not going to pull me in. You're not going to steal my happiness. I'm awake to you. And in the sutras, it says something like a vulture pecking at a rock to get some blood. There's no possibility. Okay, so we talked about the limbs on the trees. So these two areas of mindfulness of dhammas are ways we can wake up. They're waking up. In fact, the whole of the Satipatthana practice, and we haven't gone into it in a lot of detail, but we've touched on it. It is all about waking up. If you just practice mindfulness of the 4 establishments of mindfulness, as we've been talking about on this retreat, then it's the path to awakening. And a lot of practitioners just do that. I think I mentioned, if you can remember, I mentioned on my last Dharma talk here, I mentioned there's a couple of paths to awakening, a couple of paths there's 3 paths. Basically, it's serenity first, and then with that serene mind, calm mind, you direct it to experience and with insight, and you develop insight. So it's calm first and insight, then insight. The other way is insight only, and the 4 foundations of mindfulness are an insight only approach. Basically, there's no formal directed cultivation of concentration. It's all about awareness. There is concentration in it, but it's not a formal process like a cultivation of samadhi. And then the other approach was insight and serenity co-joined, and we've been experiencing that with mindfulness of breathing. So, and mindfulness of breathing is another practice that leads to awakening. And I feel very fortunate because I like to do both those practices. In fact, I do a couple of another practice as well. But I really, really, really appreciate this mindfulness of breathing. So, thus far with the mindfulness of breathing approach, we've covered 12 steps. And it's been this co-joining of insight and serenity. And what I mean by that is, if you think about the 7 factors of awakening, those have all been covered thus far. We've had mindfulness, we've had investigation of experience, or investigation of dharmas. You remember in those first 2 steps, establish mindfulness on the breathing, then be curious about it. So we've got those 2. Then we have energy. There's kind of a movement of energy towards something. So that fulfills, in many respects, that fulfills the insight component of the 7 factors of awakening. Then we have joy. We have joy. We have a whole step based on joy. And we also have tranquility. This is in the 2nd tetrad. And today, what we covered was concentration and equanimity. Though I didn't mention it overtly, that last step about liberating mind is actually covering equanimity. So thus far, there's been a co-joining of serenity and insight. Now when we get to the 4th tetrad, it's all about insight. It's just insight completely. And here are the steps. Step 13, breathing in, breathing out, contemplating impermanence. Then the next step, breathing in, breathing out, contemplating dispassion. The next step, breathing in, breathing out, contemplating cessation. Then the next step, breathing in, breathing out, letting go. That's it. Did you wake up? So I'll explain that. I'll take that apart a little bit. So the word that's used with this 4th tetrad is called contemplating. It's called contemplating. Contemplating impermanence, contemplating dispassion, contemplating cessation, which is in Pali is called anupassati, I think. I'm not a Pali scholar, but I just know a few words. And it means contemplating or tracking. So that's the same way you would describe what you're doing in the 4 establishments of mindfulness. So there's a joining up there. And this tetrad, by the way, as we've been mentioned originally, it aligns with contemplating dhammas. They're associated. Contemplating the fourth foundation and the 4th tetrad are joined in respects of contemplating dhammas. Okay. So thus far, we've been using both the cultivation of serenity and insight in combination. Now, we're just using insight, the insight approaches. And as I mentioned before, what we're doing with insight is looking at conditionality, how one thing leads to another, how one thing conditions another. We're also looking at these three characteristics of existence. And we've mentioned them a few times, but I'm going to just highlight them a bit more. So the three characteristics of existence: impermanence. In Pali it's anicca, dukkha, or unsatisfactoriness, and anatta, or not self. So these three characteristics, in the four foundations of mindfulness practice, there's an emphasis on all three. Within the satipatthana, within the mindfulness of breathing practice, however, it emphasizes impermanence. Just emphasizes impermanence. The wonderful thing, however, is if you contemplate one of these, you're also realizing the others. They kind of go together. Like, for example, if you're seeing the impermanence of a falling leaf, you'll also begin to see the dukkha nature of it, and also the not self nature of it. That's probably not a good example. I should say something about myself. If you begin to notice impermanence, contemplate impermanence within yourself, you'll also realize there's a unsatisfactory nature in this, say, the body. There's an unsatisfactory nature in the body because it changes. And because it changes and there's an unsatisfactory nature in it, well, not because of its unsatisfactory nature, but because it changes, it's also not a thing. It's a changing process. So when we start to contemplate impermanence, we also start to contemplate the changing nature of things, the unsatisfactory nature of things, as well as their not self nature. The other thing that goes here is that if you can be aware of, say, impermanence in a falling leaf, as an example, this is how I've used it at other times, you can also be aware of how impermanent tormenting thoughts are. And when you can be aware of how tormenting thoughts are impermanent, you can also be aware how they are uncertain. And one way dukkha is described is uncertainty. Nothing certain. Nothing certain. You know, there's a saying in mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, it goes like this. Thoughts are not facts to be believed. In other words, what happens with thoughts, we tend to believe them. But they are unreliable. They're just changing events and we get sucked into them. We believe them to be facts. Just because I'm thinking something doesn't mean it's a fact. And this is a problem with depression, because we'll have all sorts of thoughts like, you know, I'm a terrible person, I'm a failure, I'm a worthless so-and-so, and blah, blah, blah. So not only do we believe it, but we also take it personally. So coming back to these three characteristics, if we can start to see the impermanence in a leaf, that can be generalized to a distressing thought or a distressing emotion or whatever, anything, any conditioned phenomena. Then we can also see its unreliability, its uncertainty, and also we see that there's no thing in it of it all. It's just a passing event. It's just a process. We don't have to take it personally. It's liberating. So that's just something about these three characteristics of existence. And what we do with this, what is it? The 13th? Yeah, 13, 14, 15, 16. Yeah, the 13th step is we start to contemplate impermanence. And you can contemplate impermanence with all sorts of things. Just look out here, just in life. You see it all the time. People are moving around, things are happening, wind's blowing. It's all impermanent. I don't find it too hard to contemplate impermanence. I got glasses. I had to wear glasses when I was 42 when I went back to university to study my masters. I couldn't read anything, so I had to go and get glasses. I started wearing hearing aids when I was 60. I used to jog a lot. These days I can't jog so much. My knees are starting to go. And also the other day I rode up a hill with a backpack on and I wrecked my hip. So I was out of action for a couple of weeks. And just on Friday, I went to the dentist. Actually, the week before I went to the dentist, I had some pain, and he brought me back to see another dentist. And the dentist is kind of looking at all these cracks in my teeth and says, "Oh, yeah, these are the result of lots of fillings, and you have a strong bite, and you eat a lot of crunchy things." Oh, I'm kind of falling apart. And this is the way it is. It's the truth of things. I'm 69 in 2 months, getting close to 70. Not that 70 is a magic number or anything like that, but people start to get... Actually, we get old when we're 60, I think. I mean, is that over the hill? Or is it 50 these days? Or 50? Yeah, it is good. It is good. You know why it's good? Because when you go, I used to say, when you turn 50, you're over the hill. It's all downhill from here. But it means you don't have to pedal anymore. You don't have to prove yourself. You don't have to be anybody. You've done it. And, now I'm late 60s. I don't have to do anything anymore. I mean, I can just ride downhill and my body falls apart. But do you notice something? We're laughing about it. There's something about seeing impermanence. Seeing impermanence. What happens is you develop a disenchantment for things. What used to bring me great excitement and pleasure and, I would look forward to, all the rest of it, it no longer holds its allure. It no longer kind of drags me in. And, things that could have got me... I'm not very much of an angry type, but I know a few angry types. Things that would have got me irritated and angry and maybe pushed me into a rage, which tends not to happen with me too much. But I do have a lot of cravings. I must admit I was a really craving after sensual pleasure person. As we grow older and we get more disenchanted, as we start to see things passing away, we become dispassionate about them. Dispassion here means our cravings for them start to fade away. They're not as enticing as they used to be. I remember when mindfulness became popular, and this is particularly about 15 years ago because I was writing a paper. When did I write that paper? I wrote a paper for a book on the foundations of mindfulness. I think it was about... it was published in 2015, so probably I started writing the paper in about 2014. I remember writing this paper and looking at what mindfulness is. And mindfulness had been popularized by, in a wonderful way by MBSR, and everybody took it on. And then you started to see mindful toilet paper, mindful cookies, going on luxury mindfulness journeys or something like that. It became a marketing thing, and it was about, because you could be mindful, one could be excited and one could have more pleasure with things. If you were mindful eating a beautiful chocolate, I think they might have even had mindful chocolate. Is there such a thing as mindful chocolate? I think they might be, because you're really mindful of the taste. You're really getting into the pleasure of it. There is something about mindfulness that we become aware of impermanence, but if we focus on the arisings of things, it's really exciting. I'm having a mindful cup of tea now. It's really pleasurable. I'm really getting into it. So we look forward to the next pleasure, and so on and so forth. And I think that's missing the point. The Buddha didn't teach mindfulness in order for you to have more pleasure. But it certainly does that. I remember when I first ate my mindful meal, I thought, wow, this meal's really nice. And do you notice how tasty the meals are here? I think it's the good cook, but it's also our mindfulness, because you're not being distracted by anything. You're just focusing on this new taste sensation. However, if you focus on the passing away, that's what impermanence is, arising and passing. Everything's arising and passing. Everything's being born and dying. All this, if you start to focus on the passing of things, you start to develop dispassion. And it's not depression. It's more like a cool heart. I'm endeavouring to come to terms with my cracking teeth and my hearing aids that were turned up last Monday. Last week I went to an audiologist on Monday. I went to a skin specialist and he found a BCC on my forehead on Wednesday. I went to my GP to get some results from tests on Thursday, and I went to the dentist on Friday. This is what happens when you get old. And if you can contemplate it, see the passing away, what can you do? You have to develop a cool heart. So things that were once exciting lose their appeal, lose their allure, and they lose their rage. And it is not that we become depressed or anything like that. It's that we're developing dispassion. It's called dispassion. Passion here refers to cravings after things, after pleasures, or cravings to push something away. Actually, there's 3 types of craving, and I won't give a big talk on craving right now, but I'll just let you know them. There's craving for sensual pleasures, which is pretty easy to understand, especially when we consider our addictions. And pleasures here of the senses, including mind. There's cravings to be somebody. We want to be somebody. I want to be liked. I want to be famous. I want to be something. Remember the old film? There was an old 40s film. Cary Grant, I think, was in it. He was having a hard time, and he said to his wife, "I want to be somebody. I want to be somebody." It's like we have a craving to be something. We crave for people to acknowledge us, to recognize us. And the other craving is to not be. The craving to shut it off. Sometimes it's like aversion, and it's just a kind of, I've had enough of this. I just want to turn it all off. I want to block myself off. I want to go to bed, sleep. Or at its extreme levels, I want to kill myself. So there's 3 types of cravings. And what happens with dispassion, the cravings fade away. They fade away. And this is the 14th step, dispassion. And it's really cooling. It's really cooling of the heart. The next step is cessation. And this morning we were talking about cessation because you asked about enlightenment, and I was just thinking that maybe in cessation nothing happens. Maybe there's a flat line, but I don't know. I mean, with some people they say there's a complete blackout or a lights out moment of no consciousness. I don't think people die, but maybe they do, or they go into suspended animation or something. I'm not sure, but that's one way of thinking about it, one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it could be, there's probably 11 different ways of looking at it, and these 11 different ways go with the 12 links of dependent arising. Sometimes dependent arising is described as these 12 linked processes that lead on from one another. It's like, I think I mentioned earlier that when we have contact with the experience, like that's a link, we have feelings. If we have pleasant feelings, it leads to craving after. If we have an unpleasant feeling, it leads to craving to push away. And if we have a neither pleasant or unpleasant feeling, we kind of go around in circles, as Lisa described. The point I'm making is that these these links. Contact leads to feelings. Feelings lead to craving. Craving leads to grasping. Grasping leads to becoming. Becoming leads to birth, aging, sickness, death, and a whole mass of suffering. And just kind of goes around in a circle. So, how did I get onto that? I've just got to track back for a moment. What was I talking about? Cessation, that's right. So every link, you can have a cessation in those links. Like, if you're mindful of feelings as just feelings, it can cease there, it can stop there. You don't need to crave, so craving can stop there. If you can be aware of craving, it can cease and so you have a ceasing somewhere else. It's like if you can cease somewhere in this chain, everywhere else will cease. So when you talk about cessation, it means stopping something. So you remember in dependent arising, I said when this ceases, that ceases, that ceases. When this is not, that is not. When this ceases, that ceases. So cessation here means because we're not, craving after experience, new experiences will arise, but we don't crave to have them continue. They just arise naturally and they fade away and they stop, and we're not craving after continuing them. So this is an experience we can have. And the next step, the final step, actually I'm going pretty good. Only 10 to 8. I haven't gone over time. The next experience we have is the last step. Letting go. Letting go. I've met a few times, and I gave him a massage many, many years ago. The Venerable Sumeto. He's one of the foremost foreign monks in Thailand. He went and ordained. He went over there in Peace Corps, I think, and he was in the army as a medical officer in the army in Korea, I think, and ended up in Thailand. And he ended up ordaining as a monk and found his way into a Chan Chas monastery, and he became the first monastic in a Chan Chas monastery. This is back in the 60s, I think. Very old. And I'd been to Thailand. I'd come back, and Prakandi Palo said, "Malcolm, you should go down and give this monastic a massage." I'd never met him in Thailand, but I went to the monastery in Stanmore in Sydney, Wat Budurungsi, and I offered him a massage. And he was so cool. He was so present. And he was talking about, he said, "I'm nearly 50. I'm going to die soon. I'm going to die soon." As this, kind of this real, genuine realization that he's going to die one day. He's still alive at the moment. He's living in Thailand, and he's probably in his 90s. I think he might be 92 or something like that. I did hear him once describe the Eightfold Path. He said you could describe it in 2 words: letting go. That's it. Letting go. So what happens, we're in this 4th tetrad. We've had all the experiences of leading up to this. We've done all these practices. We've worked through relaxation, and we've worked through the 7 factors of awakening, and we've done tranquility, and our minds have got very concentrated. We developed equanimity. We saw a liberated mind, and then we've contemplated impermanence. With that powerful mind, we contemplated impermanence. We developed dispassion, cessation, and this is the final step: letting go. And we let go of it all, everything. It's just a letting go, and letting go, and letting go. And that's the inclination to Nibbana. That's Nibbana being freedom. So clinging to a self that is impermanent leads to suffering. And the opposite of clinging is letting go to nature. And when we let go, we incline towards the unconditioned. We incline towards the unborn. We incline towards nibbana. And nibbana is beyond language to describe. It's outside the realm of our usual understanding about the world. I was listening to a science teacher talk about 8 dimensions of the world. 12 dimensions of the world, and he summarized them as 5. And these dimensions of the world were like an x-axis. I can't remember which one's y-axis is upright, an x-axis at right angles to it, and I don't know what the axis would be like that. A z-axis, is it? So x, y, z. So that gives us 3 dimensions. Another dimension is time, and another dimension is imagination. So it kind of collects all these dimensions, and what we have is a world. So nibbana is not of the world. It doesn't have those dimensions. It doesn't have any concoctability. It doesn't have like imagination creating it. It is unconditioned. It's outside of the worldly ways of understanding things. It's like a realization. It's a realization. It's like it's always here, but we never see it because we're so caught up in our own constructions of the world, constructions of ourselves and the world around us, that we don't see what we're caught up in. However, if you can have a glimpse of nibbana, even just a glimpse, it's like you step outside this normal construction of a self and you see it for what it is, which is a construction. It's a construction. I mean, and the whole of samsara is kind of caught up in these constructions. This is not to minimize the objective reality or not to discount there is an objective reality. There is an America and there is Gaza and there's a Ukraine and there's an Australia and there's home and all these places. But much of what we know about the world and much of what we perceive about the world is our mental constructions. So with an awakened heart, those who have an awakened heart have also been described. An awakened heart. Sorry, I'm just going to read my last paragraph here. An awakened heart has been described as silent, still, radiant, luminous, knowing, peaceful, and pure. The purity of an awakened heart refers to how awareness is no longer obscured by mental afflictions. Lisa talked about this the other night. It's like the mental afflictions, the mental distortions, which include all these, the hindrances, for example, they occlude us from seeing reality, and all we see is these, we're seeing through the filter of these afflictions. An awakened heart is no longer obscured by afflictions. And according to all Buddhist traditions, awakened ones are completely free from mental afflictions. When there's no cause for suffering, there's no suffering. Thus, the awakened ones are completely free from mental suffering. And on that note, we come to the end of our talks about the 4 foundations of mindfulness and the 4 tetrads of mindfulness of breathing. And tomorrow night, which is the final talk of the retreat, I'll be talking about awakening, what that means. So at both noble and ennobling levels, and I'll explain what that means. I'll explain it now quickly. A noble level, in my view, involves awakening to Nibbana, awakening to the realization of Nibbana, and an ennobling awakening may not have that extent of awakening to Nibbana, but it's going in on the pathway to awakening. And I think we can think about therapy as being on that ennobling path. We have ennobling awakenings. We have realizations about patterns that we might be caught up in, and we wake up to them and we do something different. So thanks you for listening, and may we all realize the peace of awakening. Thank you. So let's have a few moments quiet to contemplate, to let it sink in.